Hello, everyone. Welcome to our QH webinar series. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Nico Voigtländer as our speaker. Nico is now Professor of Economics at UCLA Anderson School of Management. I believe most of us, especially students and colleagues in the field of economic history, development, and political economy, have been very familiar with Nico's work on many fascinating topics ranging from the rise of Nazi, fertility transition, industrial revolution, and the European Enlightenment movement, and so on. So in the following, Nico will give us 1 hour presentation, followed by a short discussion session. Today, we are also very happy to invite Professor Debbie Ma from Hitotsubashi University and Tokyo as our discussant. Later, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, picking up some questions from the audience. So, Nico, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Shall I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. All right. Do you see the screen?
Yeah, good.
Okay, perfect. So this is joint work with my great former PhD student, Sebastian Oettinger, who is now a postdoc at Northwestern University. And the paper looks at the effect of national leaders on state performance. Now, before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about what we do know about the role of leaders more generally. And in particular, there is evidence at the more disaggregate level that leaders do indeed matter. For example, if you have CEOs who served for different firms, so they were leading different firms over different time periods, then you can run a regression where you include CEO fixed effects, and these will absorb the effects that CEOs have on their firm's performance, in particular firm growth. And then you can interpret this as evidence for leaders do matter in terms of leading firms. You can do something similar with Chinese data, where you have this advantage that city governors over the course of their career are assigned to different cities. And then once again, you can include governor fixed effects and then filter out these effects of governors on their city's growth or economic performance. Now, when it comes to the national level, there's much less systematic evidence. And this is despite the fact that there was a huge debate starting in the 19th century, and this is still ongoing, as to whether national leaders do actually matter for the performance of their states. So, for example, back in the 19th century, some people would say, that history is really just a reflection of the great men that were governing states. And on the other hand, people such as Karl Marx would say, no, history or leaders, on the other hand, are just history's slaves. So leaders just reflect what's going on during the period when they're in power. And for example, if it hadn't been for Napoleon, then someone else would have risen to power in France around the turn of the 19th century, and outcomes would have been very similar. So there's this huge debate going on as to whether individuals did or did not, or do not matter for state performance. Now, economists have brought identification to the table here, but in so far in a relatively restricted manner. So we have a very nice paper by Jones and Olken from 2005 in the QJE that looks at leadership transitions. So essentially, it looks at what happens after the random death of a leader, what happens to GDP just after this random death. And on average, you find a small reduction in GDP after a leader has deceased for some random reason. Now, this is, of course, very nice to know that leaders do matter because GDP growth changes. But on the other hand, there are some open issues remaining. So, for example, leader quality is not observed. Instead, the only thing that you really observe in the data is that growth slightly declines on average after a leader has died. Also, you can only apply this methodology to the modern era because you basically need annual data on country performance or annual GDP, because you have to look on a narrow band around this random death of a leader, just a few years before and after. And so you can't really relate this to this big open debate on historical leaders. And then finally, and this is really quite an important issue here, while the death of the leader is random by this very definition of this setup on random transitions, so the death is random, but the subsequent appointment of the next leader is of course endogenous and could be related to economic potential or even economic performance of the country at that time. So quite a few open issues remaining. We have gone some length in terms of identification, but ideally what we would want is we would want to randomly appoint national leaders of varying ability, and then we would want to observe state level outcomes during their ruling period. And here in this paper, we argue that the context of early modern Europe, so late medieval, early modern Europe, takes us relatively close to this ideal. So we study European monarchs over the period roughly 1000 till 1800. And for identification, we use two features from that period. The first is that who became the next ruler was predetermined simply by hereditary succession. So it was clear that, for example, the firstborn son would be the next ruler of a state or country. And importantly, that was independent of ruler ability. So even if it was foreseeable that there was the heir to the throne was not particularly talented, if it was the firstborn son, he would still succeed on the throne. So that's the first element here. And then the second element is that we get quasi-random variation in ruler ability because of inbreeding. So what's important about this period is that these negative effects of inbreeding that we know very well today, they were not understood until the 1920s. So these rulers back then, they didn't know about these negative effects of inbreeding. And even if they had known, there was so much hidden inbreeding in these complex family trees that it would have been incredibly hard for them to foresee that a certain type of marriage would have led to a very high degree of inbreeding of the offspring. So we will exploit this in our IV strategy here for identification. To get there, what we have to do is we have to build a new reign level data set, which in itself is challenging, because when you go back to historical data, typically you have urbanization rates as outcomes, or you have the medicine GDP data, but these are only at century or 50-year intervals. So you can't really get performance during a reign of a ruler. So what we do here is we provide a new data set that codes ruler ability. And also we have several proxies for state performance during each ruler's reign. So not just over a century, so let's say not just Germany or the German territory between 1500 and 1600, but really during the performance of the state during the reign of a certain ruler. And what we find is that ruler ability does affect state performance. And here are our three outcome variables. So one is a broad measure of state performance. I'll talk about that in detail. So just in terms of making this easy to interpret, we interpret everything in terms of standard deviation, so just standardized coefficients. So a 1 standard deviation increase in ruler ability leads to about 0.8 standard deviation increase in general state performance. Also, a 1 standard deviation increase in ruler ability leads to the state territory expanding by about 18%, which is quite sizable. And the urban population of the state also increases by about 19%. Okay? So these are our main outcome variables. And in the second set of results, we find that if there are substantial constraints, substantial political constraints, such as parliaments on rulers, then that mutes the effect of ruler ability. So in a way, this is saying, if you have a very incapable ruler, it doesn't matter that much if there's a strong constraint on the executive, on the ruler. So if parliament can jump in if there's a crazy ruler trying to ruin the country. So that's preview of our findings. And if there are any clarifying questions, please just jump in. Okay, in terms of contribution and related literature, we contribute to 3 strands broadly of the literature. One is a literature that has been arguing that national leaders matter or do not matter. I briefly talked about that before. So there are many historians, including Weber, who argue that leaders really do matter. So history is just the great man story. Versus Marx, Engels, Tolstoy, who argue that in the end, leaders are just slaves of history. So they just conform to the constraints of history, and a great man cannot change much because it's just this historical setting that constrains them. I briefly talked about the modern evidence here from leadership transitions. And what we bring to the table here is we're the first paper to provide causal identification using quasi-random variation in ruler ability. And so we really look at ruler ability. That is the explanatory variable here and that we instrument for. Whereas the previous literature has only looked at random deaths of leaders, but there wasn't really ruler ability that was coded. Then we contribute to a literature that has looked at the institutional environment and how this institutional environment mediates the effects of leaders. One thing that's interesting here is that over time, we see that inbreeding becomes worse and worse with these dynasties in Europe ruling. And that also means that ruler ability potentially suffers. But at the same time, parliaments, at least in Northwestern Europe, become stronger. So one implication of our results is that parliaments might have protected Northwestern European states from these negative effects of ever more inbreeding of their rulers. And then finally, there's a very broad literature that looks at do leaders matter. So for example, my former colleague Christian Dippel and Stefan Heblich, they have just published a paper in the AR where they show that these 1848ers, German revolutionaries who came to the US, were important in terms of leading US communities when they arrived in the US. So here what we bring to the table is that we show which traits of leaders actually matter and shed light on ruler ability in particular. Okay, so that's just in terms of brief summary of our contribution. And then let's get started with data and historical background. I'll go very, very quickly over the historical background. So it's a very interesting period. There are libraries being filled with work about this period in late medieval and early modern Europe. So it's the period that coincides with the formation of essentially what we know now today as the map of states in Europe. The Roman Empire collapses in medieval times, and then afterwards you see this emergence of states. So let me just show you the map here. These are the states that are in our data set. So we have England, France, Austria, Denmark, Norway, England, Scotland, and then Spanish states. And you see how over time there's more and more consolidation of the European map. England, France, Spain, and so on already as we know it today. Okay. Now, in terms of data collection, the first challenge is we need information on ruler ability. So how do you measure that? So here we go back to a historian slash histiometrist by the name of Frederick Adam Woods. And he was basically a social Darwinist with a somewhat, from today's point of view, crazy hypothesis. So his hypothesis was that intellectual and moral ability is inheritable. Now, back in the day, so he lived around the turn of the 20th century. How do you get data in order to test that? Right? So what his idea was is, well, let's study the biographies of historical rulers. And in these biographies, let's look for these traits such as intellectual capability, and then see if that is being passed on from one ruler to the next. And it simply, so he chose, Woods chose to study historical rulers simply because for those data were available or historical information was available. But so his coding is then, so his coding for ruler ability is really just very simple. So he codes plus, neutral, so plus, minus, and minus, and we just translate this into 1, 0, and -1. And if you want to have a little more detail here, so for example, for Charles II of Spain, he has a very short summary of the capabilities. So he calls him an imbecile. And indeed, Charles II is the most inbred ruler in our data set. On the other hand, if you look at Charles III, calls him, so Woods calls him enlightened, efficient, just, and sincere, not brilliant, but had a very well-balanced mind. Okay, so this is this coding by Woods, which in turn is based on Woods reading many biographies of these historical rulers and translating these into a coding. Now, of course, you might say, well, this person, might have been biased and so on. So one of the first things we do is we validate Woods coding. So we asked RAs, without showing them this Woods coding, to also go for historical sources. And in addition, also through modern biographies, such as Wikipedia, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and so on. And we asked them to verify the Woods coding. And we did that for a sample of 166 rulers. So this is a bin scatter here, right? So this is not each point here is more than one ruler. Just we plot a bin scatter. And we see that indeed there's a strong correlation between the coding by Woods and the coding by our research assistants. Right? So we broadly confirm that coding. Now, might there be a bias in the coding? First answer, this is going to be addressed by our IV. But also what's important to keep in mind is that Woods' hypothesis would actually work against our IV. And this is because he believed that inbreeding strengthened royal dynasties. So his belief was really that inbreeding is good because if the blood of highly or the blood of royal families is mixed, then you get even more capable rulers. So that works exactly against what we have in our IV strategy. And what's also important to keep in mind is that the measure of inbreeding was actually unknown until the 1920s. Okay, so Woods, when he coded the data, he could not know how much inbreeding there actually was. So he really just based his coding on reading these biographies. Okay, so that was first challenge, code ruler ability. Next challenge is, how do we code state performance? We first use a broad outcome variable, and that's also coded by Woods later on. So Woods then also became interested in state performance, and he coded, so it's, for example, let's look at Spain under the rule of Charles II, who was this not very capable ruler. And there, Woods assesses Spain's performance as misery, poverty, hunger, disorders, decline, and so on. So all based on reading of historical sources. So then Spain's performance during that reign would be coded as minus, right? And again, we validate this, asking RAs to blind code based on both historical and more modern biographies. And we broadly confirm in a sample of more than 200 states or state time observations, we do confirm the coding by Woods. Okay, very good. Then you might say, this is just a state performance, it's still a subjective assessment. So even if your RAs were neutral, which is hard to believe, but if they were neutral, then still historians might have been biased in assessing state performance. And then when our RAs read the historical sources, that bias will persist. So to address exactly this concern, we have two additional measures that are much more objective. One is change in the log area, so just basically percentage change in area during each ruler's reign. So to get there, we have maps that Scott Abramson kindly shared with us, which cover all European states at 5-year intervals over the period, broadly the period that we examine. And then we link this to the beginning and the end of each reign. Let me give you an example. So this is Austria during the reign of Maria Theresa. And you see that Austria lost the territories in red here, but it gained the territories in green. And on net, this comes down to a gain by 7%. Okay, so for Austria, during the reign of Maria Theresa, our outcome variable percentage change in log area would be equal to 7%. Now you might say, well, maybe Maria Theresa gained 7%, but maybe she lost all the valuable territories and she just gained relatively less valuable, less urban areas. So what we do here to address this is we have a third outcome variable that looks at the change in total urban population in these boundaries or in these borders of a state at the end versus at the beginning of a reign. So essentially, if you lose a lot of urban territory, that variable is going to look very bad. Okay, so this addresses this concern that just looking at area might miss the point that maybe you conquer 2 huge cities, but you lose a bunch of territory that's much less important and more rural. So that's exactly addressed by this third outcome variable. Okay, very good. So those are the outcome variables. So overall, we have a new ruler reign level data set for more than 300 European monarchs. Period I've shown you before, cover 13 states and more than 50 dynasties. So just to give you an overview of sample coverage. So we have, for example, Aragon, which later merges into Spain, covered from around 1050 until 1800. Austria shows up on the map somewhat later and so on. So this is really just to give you a broad idea about the coverage of the data set. Okay. So let me see, there's a comment. Oh, okay, so I'm not supposed to answer to comments, right? So I'll just continue. But again, so if anyone on the panel has a clarifying question, please feel free. Then we also have an extended data set that has 437 European monarchs, and I'll show you some results on that as well. So here, Woods stopped, our primary source, Frederick Adam Woods, he stopped his coding in 1790. So we then coded the same observations until 1914, until the First World War. So extended Woods data. And we also looked for more reigns and found data on Poland and Hungary. So we can also add more reigns. But the core data is really going to be the Woods sample. The reason being that, as I mentioned before, if anything, the hypothesis that Woods had in coding would work against our identification strategy, because ultimately he believed that inbreeding between monarchs would lead to good outcomes. Okay, so we decided to stick for the main data with these Woods data because it stakes the odds against us. All right, OLS results. That should be relatively quick. And then we focus much more on the IV results. So OLS results, just documenting the patterns in the data. We find a strong relationship between ruler ability and state performance. This holds equally if we include state fixed effects. So here, then we only identify variation within states. So different rulers of different ability for the same state are associated with different state performance, and the strong relationship remains. We also find a strong relationship between ruler ability and aerial gains in land area, and also between urban population. Okay. So that's the OLS results, and I'll show you a little bit of OLS robustness, but as I said, I want to spend much more time on the identification. So here results are robust if we say we exclude regencies. This, for example, is a common concern. So could it be that if a ruler at the time when he's appointed is still very young, and then you have a regency over a period, so you have regents taking care of the state, that if we exclude these periods of regency, that doesn't affect our results. Or if we exclude foreign rule, where you have a ruler from one country also ruling over another country, doesn't change our result. If we extend the sample, I mentioned this before, until 1914, we find very similar results. And also, if we add Poland and Hungary to the sample, we also find very similar results. So really overall, very robust OLS relationship. Then We can also code this differently, and I won't bore you with that. But essentially, if we use our own coding of the data, it works just as well as if we use the Woods data. And we can use different kinds of specifications, all kinds of clustering, and so on. Maybe one thing that's interesting to look at is what about heterogeneity in results? So basically interact ruler ability with variables such as female, or if the ruler was very young when he ascended to the throne, or say, is there a difference when there was regicide of the father of the ruler? And none of these really seems to matter for our results. So you see the interaction term between these different variables and ruler ability is always quantitatively small and statistically insignificant. So for example, here, this would tell you that a highly capable female ruler is indistinguishable from a highly capable male ruler. So ruler ability is associated just as strongly with state performance for men and for women. Okay? So that's what this small insignificant coefficient here tells you. And one thing that's interesting, and I'll get back to this at the end of the talk when we talk about constraints on the executive. So you see that this is just a coefficient plot. So the coefficient here in the earlier periods until 1500, the coefficient you see is around 0.7. And that's just the coefficient, let me be completely clear, that is just the coefficient that comes from the from regressing state performance on ruler ability, controlling for state fixed effects. Okay, so if we look at this coefficient at different points in time, there we go, then we see that over time, this coefficient becomes weaker. So over time, the correlation between ruler ability and state performance becomes weaker. And we will see later on that this coincides with the period where parliaments actually grow more powerful across Europe. And that is probably what this pattern here is reflecting, that you get these smaller coefficients over time. And this is also confirmed when you look at the coefficient for individual countries. So again, the coefficients here tell you what's the correlation between ruler ability and state performance. And you see here, for example, for England, so first of all, coefficient is positive and significant for almost all countries. Then for England, we split this into before 1600 and after 1600. And you see that before 1600, England looks much like all the other countries in terms of this correlation. But then if you look after 1600, where the English parliament becomes more powerful, you see actually there's no more correlation between ruler ability and state performance. And that's, again, that's something that I'll explore towards the end of the talk in a systematic fashion. So done with OLS results. Then we can look at IV results, the IV results. Let me repeat these two crucial features that we exploit here for identification. The first is that it was predetermined who would become the next ruler, independent of how capable or incapable that ruler was. So for example, I mentioned this Carlos II of Spain, who was highly inbred, and it was clear from childhood on that he would be a terrible ruler, but he was still appointed king of Spain. The second important dimension that we exploit is inbreeding. So we get this quasi-random variation in ruler ability, and this relies on these dynasties that were intermarrying for centuries in Europe, both within dynasties, but also across dynasties that would then already be related. And this genetic closeness leads to the potential for genetic disorders, which then give us these negative effects of inbreeding on ruler ability. So we combine these two features for identification. And let me emphasize again, these negative effects of inbreeding were actually unknown to monarchs, and they were unknown at the time of ruler, of when Woods coded ruler ability. So to be completely precise, we use the coefficient of inbreeding as an instrument for ruler ability. So let me show you as our most prominent example. So this is Charles II of Spain, and here you see the family tree. So the parents of Charles II were uncle and niece. Okay, so uncle and niece. that's pretty bad, but it's not terrible. It's not like siblings marrying. But then if you go back in the family tree, you see that there are a lot of interrelations, close relationships that go back in time over at least the previous 3 generations. And you see here that there were 3 siblings, Charles V, Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire, and his sister, or their sister, Isabella of Austria. So these 3 siblings had offspring whose offspring then again intermarried. So you just had this huge pool of inbreeding that was lingering. And then when Charles II's parents married, that all came together. And you got this huge degree of inbreeding of Charles II. So that's a picture of Charles II. He has been described as an imbecile. His tongue was too big to speak clearly. He was also characterized as short, lame, and senile. And sure enough, during his reign, as we've seen before, Spain was in decline and he left no heir. He actually didn't have any children. Now contrast this with Charles III, Carlos III. So there's actually still a university in Madrid named after him, Carlos III. And he was not appointed immediately after Charles II, as you see here. In fact, what's interesting is if you look at the succession, so the dynasty of the Spanish Habsburgs finishes with Carlos II, and then a new dynasty rises to power, the Spanish Bourbon dynasty in 1700. And initially the ruler that's appointed, the first of the Spanish Bourbons, is relatively inbred, the second one as well, but then there's marriage with someone who's more from the outside, and as a result, Carlos III actually has a relatively low degree of inbreeding. And he is also, it turns out he's a great ruler. So he's characterized as enlightened, efficient, just, and sincere. And Spain did flourish during his reign. So that's just really a tale of 2 Carloses of Spain, reflecting what we have in mind here in our identification strategy. Now, just some brief background on the coefficient of inbreeding. There's a large literature in biology on inbreeding depression that actually does show that inbreeding increases the problem, or inbreeding does lower the IQ score. And also it increases the risks of intellectual disability quite substantially. So for example, if you have children of first cousins, then the risk of intellectual disability is 5 times higher than for unrelated parents. The reason in terms of biology is relatively straightforward. So humans are diploid, meaning that we have 2 chromosome copies, okay, and we get 1 from each parent, and only if both are deleterious, so then you get these you get these genetic disorders. But both need to be deleterious. And that's, of course, much more likely if both parents already have the same chromosome copy. And if the parents are already related, then that probability again goes up. And so that's why if you have this history of inbreeding, it becomes more and more and more likely that you see these intellectual disabilities among rulers. And there's rich evidence historically that inbreeding did negatively affect European monarchs. But we're the first paper to actually exploit this, to systematically study the relationship between ruler ability and state performance. Now, one question that often comes up is, well, wasn't there a Catholic Church ban on cousin marriage? That's correct. So there was actually a ban on cousin marriage by the Catholic Church, but that was not because the Catholic Church was worried about the negative effects of inbreeding on capability, but simply because the Catholic Church wanted to avoid the formation of powerful kin networks. So it was more of a strategic concern. And in fact, in practice, typically European monarchs would get exemptions. So the Pope himself would typically grant exemptions for these marriages among close kin, as you've seen in the family tree of Carlos II, where there was all the time marriage between cousins, aunt and niece, uncle and niece, or and so on. Okay. And what's also important here is the stock of inbreeding that had been going on over generations, that was actually unobserved when marriage decisions were made. So for the parents of Carlos II, it was impossible to calculate or see how much inbreeding there had been accumulated over the previous centuries. This possibility to compute the degree of inbreeding, as I said before, only came up in the 20th century. All right, so most important variable from now on is going to be the coefficient of inbreeding. It's generally called just F, coefficient of inbreeding. And that's just to give you some range. So for a parent-offspring marriage, that would be 0.25. For first cousins, it's 0.0625. We collect this for 246 monarchs from a website that has all this genealogical information for European monarchs. It's a crowdsourced online database, and it has been cross-checked by scientists. Okay, so it's a very reliable source. Okay, now in terms of the histogram of inbreeding of European rulers, so you see that many of them had a relatively small degree of inbreeding. But some were really highly inbred. The sort of outlier here is Carlos II, whom I've shown you before. And even if his parents were only uncle and niece, he was as inbred as siblings would be, or hypothetical offspring from a parent-child marriage. And that's all due to the fact that you had this huge accumulation of hidden inbreeding from the generations before. Okay. So then first stage relationship is just regress ruler ability on the coefficient of inbreeding. And now you might be worried, to what extent is that driven by Carlos II? So this one here is not Carlos. Again, these are actually bin scatters. So each of these dots reflects more than 10 monarchs. So we just combine this in bin scatter dots, so it's easier to see this relationship. If we exclude Carlos II, it really looks quite similar. Okay, so it's not that somehow this relationship is driven by Carlos II. Okay. And this is also, so first stage, just in terms of regressions, and instead of graphically, you see strong relation or strong predictive power of inbreeding coefficient negative on ruler ability. So the more inbreeding there is, the lower is ruler ability. And that holds if we include state fixed effects. It holds if we exclude the outlier Carlos II. It also holds if we exclude more of these rulers. So here in this example, where we exclude everyone with more than 12.5, we exclude all rulers who were inbred more than uncle, niece, or half siblings would be. Okay? And still the results go through. And then also we have some results where we only look at rulers for whom we know for sure that they rose to power because of primogeniture. So for example, here, the first Spanish ruler from the new Bourbon dynasty after Carlos II, that first ruler of a new dynasty would not be in the data set because that ruler did not rise to power because of primogeniture, because he was the firstborn son. Right? He rose to power because his dynasty was now taking over Spain. So where we know for sure that primogeniture led to the ruler being rising to power, in that subset of the data, again, we see this strong negative coefficient on the coefficient of inbreeding. Okay, very good. So then most important, the IV results. We always include state fixed effects. And just to make sure that nothing is driven by outliers, we exclude in the even columns all the inbreeding that is more than uncle niece, okay, that is more inbred than uncle niece. And you see here ruler ability instrumented for, right? So these are IV results. So here ruler ability is already instrumented for. Ruler ability has a strong causal effect on state performance, positive. it also has a strong positive effect on the area that a country or state gains during the reign of that ruler. And ruler abilities, or more capable rulers, do cause an increase in the overall urban population of their states. And you see here, so the first stage F statistic is really comfortably above the rule of thumb value of 10. So we don't have issues with weak IV in the first stage. Okay, then I can also show you reduced form results. So one nice thing about reduced form results is if you were worried about, say, ruler ability or state performance, there could be some bias in coding. There could be bias, maybe not by the guys who actually coded that, but by Woods or by our RAs, but there could be a bias by the historians themselves who evaluated and wrote about states or rulers. So if you're worried about that, then we can just look at columns 3 to 6, where we now only have objective outcome variables, and we have an objective explanatory variable, coefficient of inbreeding, right? So that's the advantage of the reduced form, is we don't need to take this intermittent step of going through ruler ability, but instead we directly regress area changes and urbanization changes on the coefficient of inbreeding. So no more room for subjectivity to somehow drive these results. And you still see this strong, as it should be, negative relationship between inbreeding and these state level outcomes. Okay, so that's if you were worried about subjectivity in coding, I think these columns here do a good job in addressing this. Then several threats to identification. Maybe I leave most of those just for the general discussion. So we can just see which of those comes up. But let me talk about the most general one. So there could be sort of an abstract concern that maybe unobservables affect marriage decisions, and they also affect state performance. So it could be that if the state is not doing well, you make some kind of strategic marriage, or if the state is doing particularly well, you have a strategic marriage, something like this. Economists are incredibly creative when it comes to coming up with alternative stories. So I think this is sort of this genre of alternative stories, that there could be something else going on that affects both marriage decisions and subsequent future state performance. So it would have to affect the marriage decision at the level of parents, and then state performance of their offspring, right? So it would have to be sort of lagged in terms of time. Now, what we can do here is we can focus only on the hidden degree of inbreeding. So let me give you a little bit of detail on this, what we mean here. Remember Carlos II? So Carlos II had a degree of inbreeding of 25, more than 25, but his parents were only uncle and niece. So uncle and niece applies a naive coefficient of inbreeding of 12.5. Okay, so if uncle and niece are otherwise not related, right, there's not this inbreeding going on over generations, but you just have uncle and niece marrying, and there's not this previous inbreeding, then you would get a coefficient of inbreeding of 12.5. Whereas if you add all of these complex relationships from the family tree that go back over generations, then you get this coefficient of inbreeding of 25, which is the actual coefficient of inbreeding. Now, when we use the hidden component of inbreeding, we just take the difference between these two, right? So for Carlos, we would subtract 12.5, which is due to uncle-niece marriage, and we would only be left with the residual, so 25 minus 12.5. And that's what we define here as the hidden degree of inbreeding, which could not possibly be calculated. So in a way, even if you think maybe they did care about uncle-niece marriage and they only did it if there was no other way, right? So the state is doing bad, and then the only one you find to marry is someone from your close family network, and then state performance is bad again afterwards when the child rises to power. So if that was the concern, then that should be addressed by us using only this hidden component, because now uncle niece doesn't matter anymore. We only use whatever has been accumulated during the generations before. And so let me show you results for when we focus only on the hidden degree of inbreeding. The first stage F statistic becomes a little bit smaller, so we lose some explanatory power, but it's not that bad because we're still comfortably above the typical thresholds. And we see that we fully confirm our IV results. So we still have this strong effect of ruler ability on state performance, changes in area, and changes in urbanization. And you can also do that in the reduced form. And you see again, so we confirm this, this nice, strong negative relationship between inbreeding and these various measures of state performance, if we use only the hidden degree of inbreeding. So I think that in terms of threats to identification, that goes a pretty long way. And then there are some others. So could there be strategic marriage? Could there be strategic marriage outside of the kin network? Maybe at this point, let me just very briefly say, as soon as you get marriage that is with a complete outsider, then you reset to zero inbreeding. So even if, say, you have a father who's highly inbred himself, but then he marries a woman from far away who's completely unrelated, then their the degree of inbreeding for their offspring would be zero. Okay, so you can reset the inbreeding by just once marrying a complete outsider. And then a concern could be, maybe you strategically marry outsiders and then you expand your territory. So when we have very low inbreeding, that's because you married an outsider who then came with a lot of extra territory. So that could potentially affect our results. But actually, we exclude from our main results all those rulers who have 0 degree of inbreeding, simply because it's coded as unknown in our main data source. But if in turn we just add these few, so you see we go up, if we include rulers whose parents were, for whom the relationship is not known, where we can presume that probably they were unrelated. So you simply cannot connect them through the history of family intermarriage. So we get a couple of extra observations and the result is essentially the same. So that concern here doesn't really seem to drive our results either. Could it be conflict? Doesn't look like it. So we can control for conflict. Doesn't change anything. Could it be founders versus descendants? So basically, a founder being not inbred, but also being the best performing member of a dynasty. That doesn't affect our results either. And then, could it be the story that somehow if there was a highly inbred firstborn son, very incapable, could it be that they murdered that child and then waited for a more highly able offspring to be born? Well, that would actually, as long as it's the same parents, that would work against our first stage, because we would get less variation in ruler ability in the first stage due to inbreeding, if parents always waited for, or if they eliminated incapable firstborn sons until there was someone more able. There's also additional ways to address this. If that issue comes up, I'm happy to talk about these. Then one more thing that I want to mention is, so far we included country or state fixed effects, but it's been hard to account for the time dimension. And this is simply because we don't really have a usual panel here, right? In a usual panel, you would have centuries, and then you can just use century fixed effects. But for us, we have these different reigns, and they often overlap. So you can't just have simple time fixed effects. Now, to address this, we came up with this strategy where we look at ruler pairs, and in particular, ruler pairs where rulers overlapped in their reign. So that implicitly, and then we only look at the difference, right? So we look at the difference in state performance for regressed on the difference in ruler ability for pairs of rulers who overlapped, who reigned at the same time. And then that, of course, implicitly takes care at the relatively finely grained level of any overall time trends. And we can include various fixed effects, which I'll show you in a moment. And we fully confirm our both OLS and IV results, even if we include the state effects, state pair fixed effects, ruler fixed effects. So because you have ruler pairs, you can even include ruler fixed effects, and we can even include state pair interacted with century fixed effects. So really very robust, and this time dimension doesn't seem to confound our results. Now, what about mechanisms? How exactly does that work? So, for example, one concern that sometimes comes up is, what if it's not so much actually ability, but it could be that if you have a highly inbred monarch, then that person is not only incapable intellectually, but it could also be a short person who just isn't very convincing and imposing, and that's why you see these negative effects on state performance. Well, let me start by just looking at some correlates of inbreeding. So here we have coefficient of inbreeding as the explanatory variable. We know that from before. So ruler ability, so whatever I told you so far about ruler ability, that was of course the cognitive ability of rulers as coded by Woods. We also went back to the original data that Woods looked at, and we coded non-cognitive ability. And that is also strongly negatively related with inbreeding, just as it should be. And I'll talk about that in a moment a little more. But let's focus here on the other outcome variables. So for example, tenure, how long was the reign of a ruler? How old was the ruler when he ascended to the throne? Was there regicide? How long did the ruler live? What about the number of children? Was the ruler tall? And there's no relationship with being tall. And what was the general physical appearance? So physical appearance, here we went back to the historical sources and we looked at, was a ruler characterized as weak or was he characterized as strong? And missing values, we just code them as 0. So strong would be 1, weak -1. And you see there's no relationship between either the ruler being particularly tall and inbreeding, or the ruler having a certain physical appearance and inbreeding. So to make this short, it doesn't seem to be these other correlate or possible correlates of inbreeding. We just don't see it in our data. So the two variables that really are strongly correlated with inbreeding are cognitive and non-cognitive ability. So we can also directly control for length of reign, age at death of the ruler, number of children, whether the ruler was tall, physical appearance, or all together. And you see that our IV results are really very stable controlling for these. Now, very quickly on non-cognitive ability. So we know from work, for example, by James Heckman, that non-cognitive ability is also very important among individuals and especially rulers. So we code, or not decision makers, I'm not saying ruler because we're the first to show that for historical rulers. So we code a measure of non-cognitive ability. Again, looking at these historical sources. So if a ruler was described as outgoing or emotionally stable or something along similar lines, then we code this as 1. A -1 would be rulers who are characterized, for example, as neurotic or phlegmatic. And if we look at the outcome, then we find that for cognitive and non-cognitive ruler ability, they're both strongly related to inbreeding. And for both, we find strong effects on state performance. So it's not just cognitive ability, but also this sort of being emotionally capable to understand and read other human beings. So this would be typical non-cognitive ability. Okay. I don't have much time, so maybe later, if this comes up. So we have detailed data on which type of state performance, so law and order in particular. Strong leaders affect law and order. They affect the general living conditions, agricultural performance, and commerce. If we look at conflict as an outcome variable, that I can do in 10 seconds, and because this is very interesting. So overall, able rulers have fewer conflicts, but this is all driven by external conflicts. Okay? So this seems to suggest that capable rulers are less likely to engage in external conflict. And if we decompose urban growth, that's also interesting. We see that if you look at two, let's just focus on the IB results. Okay, so IB overall, we've seen this before, strong predictive power of ruler ability on overall urbanization. Now you can disentangle this into an intensive margin, which would mean, does the urban population in cities that are already in the reign of a ruler, does that urban population grow? And an extensive margin, which would grow if the ruler conquers new cities. And you see this relationship between ruler ability and urban population is all driven by capable rulers adding new urban areas to their territory. So that then gives this interesting combined effect. So for conflict, we've seen that rulers are actually less likely overall to have international conflicts, but they're also more likely to expand into urban areas. So that means that capable rulers probably were good at selecting their conflicts. And if they engaged in external wars, it led on average to expansions of their state. So they were quite capable of sort of picking the right fights. And then finally, let me just take, I think I have 3 or 4 minutes. So I'll quickly talk about constraints on ruler power. It's a very prominent strand of literature. Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson have a lot of work on that, on the role of constraints on the executive. Let me just show you what we do here. So we code constraints on the executive at the reign level for each ruler. Okay. So take England over the 17th century. If you look at the original Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson coding in their Atlantic trade paper, they assign constraints on the executive at the century level. So for them, England throughout the 17th century would just have one value, and that's 3 here, which is a relatively low level of constraint on the executive. Then we went back to the historical data and we looked at events that changed constraints on executive power. So for example, in the years leading up to the Civil War in England, Parliament was dissolved, and therefore over some period there was less constraint on the English crown. Whereas after the Civil War, you had the Long Parliament, and there was a lot of constraint on executive power in England. Then again, you go towards the Glorious Revolution, Parliament is again dissolved, so less constraint and so on, right? So we have this much more finely grained coding of reign level constraints on the executive. And what we do is for each ruler and each country, we look at just before that ruler rises to power, what were constraints on the executive. So we do that before, because otherwise it could be endogenous, right? If you have a strong ruler, you might dissolve parliament and then be an absolutist ruler. To avoid that, we look at the constraints on the executive that the ruler inherits, so to say. All right. Let me just show you the results. So we have let's just focus in the interest of time on these first 4 columns here. So we interact ruler ability with a dummy for constrained ruler, meaning that there were substantial constraints on the executive, most prominently because of parliaments. And you see in our IB results that this interaction term is actually highly significant, negative, and quite similar in terms of magnitude to the effect on ruler ability. So what does that mean? If you add these two up, you get relatively close to 0. And that means that a constrained ruler, a ruler who faced substantial constraints on the executive, for that ruler, the ability made very little difference for changes in log area, and also it made little difference for changes in urban population. And here we don't use state performance as an outcome variable, simply because state performance, the coding of state performance is subjective. And we were worried that if you use this as an outcome variable, it might in turn be affected by constraints on the ruler. So for example, the coding of a state that has a very strong parliament might be affected by the fact that there was a strong parliament. That's why here we only use these objective outcome variables. Okay, so and then again also for urban population, again, we get relatively similar coefficient size, highly significant and negative interaction, meaning that a highly capable or incapable ruler didn't make much of a difference if there were strong constraints on the executive. Okay, so 8:02, that's exactly when I'm supposed to finish. I mean 8:02 p.m. LA time. let me just wrap up. So we built a novel data set on range-specific ruler ability, state performance, and range-specific constraints on the executive, and add to that as an instrument the degree of inbreeding. And we identify a causal link from ruler ability to state performance over about 800 years of European economic history. Why should we care about that? Well, we should care because during that period, as I've shown you earlier, the European map was actually shaped. Okay, so even if you say, you know what, this is all history, this is all gone, it's not gone because it's still there. And this inbreeding might, or our results strongly suggest that this inbreeding did actually affect the way the European map looks today. And it did so inbreeding affected the way Europe looks today by or via its effect on ruler ability. So ruler ability really did matter for the performance of states. We also showed that one likely mechanism is that capable rulers were good at picking the right conflicts, and they did so with the result of expanding their territories into more urbanized areas. And I've also shown that the effect of ruler ability was dampened by constraints on executive power. And there's this neat implication that I briefly talked about earlier, and with which I want to conclude that over time, there was more and more inbreeding being built up in these European dynasties. But at the same time, European parliaments, at least in Northwestern Europe, became stronger and stronger. So one implication of our results is that European parliaments might have helped Northwestern Europe to overcome this downside from ever more inbreeding that their dynasties were experiencing. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Nico, for the wonderful talk. Now let's turn to our discussion session. We are very happy to have Professor David Ma as our discussant. So Professor Ma, please try to restrict the discussion within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Xi-Chun, but I will actually restrict my discussion less than 15 minutes. But I mean, it's a fascinating paper. So for the other people, please do get ready to raise as many questions as possible. In some sense, it was great to be invited to discuss this paper. I've read a lot of Nico's paper. It's the first time I really hear it, and that is great. I'm not exactly, well, the obvious person to comment on the paper for two reasons. I don't know, that much about European history other than being an economic historian. The other thing is, I can only claim my course did IV for me for our paper at one point. So. But nonetheless, let me probably give comments from two perspectives. One is probably the general questions, and the other is maybe commenting a little bit from what we know about the Chinese history, which is actually quite interesting, which has so many dynasties. And that, I mean, the paper is fascinating in the sense it got me thinking a lot about some of these issues. Okay, first of all, well, I really like the paper because I think this is something that partly opened up by people like Acemoglu and Nathan Nunn, that they're taking on these extremely risky. Well, this is even more risky because they are really looking at performance, ability, personality. These things have been usually done by narrative historians, and people didn't think it was possible to not only just to measure, but even here that this is really a test. But these things are so important. I think that there's no doubt that this paper is really tackling this big issue, the great man history. I mean, again, it's really exciting all by itself when you encounter it. So I think there are a lot of really good things. I mean, very innovative design, as we see with a lot of Nico's other work, is using these designing the IV, that IV that involves. And if you read a paper, that very close reading history, it's not just coming up with some kind of a variable, but this does really require understanding of reading history. Already you can see it, that very thinking about inbreeding, and you really need to know a lot about it, and then using that as IV. So this is a very also quite imaginative construction of data sets. And the conclusion is straightforward: Lula's ability matter, which is already presented in detail. So let me raise my questions, and then I have some extensions on some of these things. I think this is this is already resolved. The cousin marriage, that was a bit of a. I probably should be aware of that the European monarchies were so different from many other places, certainly in China, partly because in the European tradition that you don't have polygamy, right? So in the case of Asia and certainly the Muslim dynasties, polygamy was very prevalent. So you end up there. Of course, you have cousin marriages as well. But in the case of China, that issue probably was not an issue, that Chinese emperor have multiple wives and concubines and so on. But I mean, this still comes a bit of a surprise. I think Nico probably already explained it. There's so much written about, how this ban on cousin marriage by the church is the rise of individualism in Western Europe and so on. But maybe that's not a particular issue anymore. I would say very quickly, again, these are probably some kind of quibbles to some degree, reading through the paper that are very common. I have a feeling that Nico has already encountered these. As a historian, we always worry about these variables, right? State performance, territory. One thing, I will come back to this a little bit later. It's almost assuming the Lula's objective function is the same as the welfare of maybe the people being ruled, the state performance, and that is something maybe we should think a bit more. Something I will come back to a little bit later. Is the expansion territory really benefiting the people that were being ruled, right? That's what we are interested in. We can see urbanizations reflecting improved economic performance. I mean, overall data, GDP data was not particularly strong. So there are a lot of data issues about these. I think in this case, I'm not really sure. I think the paper uses state effects to control most of the probably within state variation. There's very few variables about the differences in endowments between the different states. And I assume that they are relatively homogeneous because they're within a fairly narrow set of areas, right? In the case of urbanization, I would be a bit concerned that I'm just making if Australia or whatever was included, you have a very large developed agricultural sector, and that's not in the estimation. So I think Nico already talked about time trend. I think maybe most other the outcome variables are quite stationary, but urbanization, I would imagine, will be increasing over time, right? So if there's a general increase in these variables, that may be affecting it. I think it's really smart, certainly using inbreeding and primogeniture. I have difficulty pronouncing that word. That's why I can quibble. Again, this is a quibble. Is that really, think about different kind of succession rules, because that itself is fascinating. Is that really exogenous or independent? Because if somebody is raised the first son, he's supposed to take over the reign. So there are a lot of efforts in trying to educate him from, ever since his birth. So in that sense, maybe that is concerned that this is not entirely exogenous in that sense. I can't think about, one of the things that, going back to Chinese history, the Qing succession rules was quite interesting. There's the primogeniture, but they're worried about these kind of effects, or people trying to kill each other, the brothers trying to kill each other, right? So what they do is they actually have the emperor leaving a will. The will be kept in a secret box, and the will will be reviewed only after the emperor dies. So I wonder what would this be completely random in that sense? They're probably not, because the emperor is already choosing some son that is capable. But in any case, that's something to think about. It's not so much a critique. It's something to think about. One thing I'm quite curious is Lula's ability at one time independent of one another? Okay. Was it possible a strong ruler is strong because other rulers were weak? So in the international context of this was probably very important. I don't know European history that well, but if you think about the most typical case, most people think about 18th century Qing, the 3 rulers in the Qing dynasty were the strongest rulers you've ever seen. And when it gets to 19th century, all of them become fairly weak. And they all, I think that, what Nico was doing could be actually applied to that. I think Zhu and other people have worked on the Chinese emperor. But one could also argue in the 18th century, the Qing was not challenged. They were the Western imperial power far away, but by the 19th century, the Opium War came, and then all the rulers were looking terrible when the international context was shifting. So it might be interesting to discuss a bit about what is the international context. Was there a situation that all the rulers were strong, or all the rulers were weak? Okay, let me get to my last point, which is really a bit of a extension. I really like the idea rulers don't, especially the first slides, how when the parliamentary constraint was set in, rulers don't matter that much anymore. But of course, then I think it might be good to find out, what do these rulers do anymore in a constitutional monarchy, right? These, think about Prince Charles. I don't want to pick on Queen Elizabeth. It's easy to pick on Prince Charles. And, well, again, I don't want to talk about his intellectual ability and so on, but maybe it doesn't matter that much. It was with someone like the prime minister that matters a lot more. So it's not, I don't think that's what the paper is implying, that rulers don't matter anymore in democracy. It's the monarchies don't matter that much more in a monarchy. So it'll be interesting to distinguish two, and it'll be also, if there is something to test that. I do think rulers' ability really matter in a democracy as well. You can think about, but in that case, that's the prime minister, that's the president. That will be probably a separate paper. And I think in this context, it was done very, very nicely. But it might be good to distinguish. It's a little bit extension for what we already did. My last question, this is really coming from maybe the earlier conversation we had to begin with. Again, in the Chinese context, whether the ruler's objective function is the same as the welfare of the ring, of the people, or even of the elites, right? So if a ruler is a bad ruler, it will be actually good that person is done. And if a ruler is a bad ruler, it's terrible if he's also intellectually, physically capable. And I can think of many rulers in Chinese history who bring in disasters. I mean, the first founding ruler of Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, who lived until 80-something, who I don't know how many children he has. And he worked 12 hours a day. He basically brought command economy to China. Some people would say, economic depression, disaster, and so on. And then you compare with the Wan Li Emperor. There's a very nice, very popular book written by Ray Huang, right? That's very popular in China, but it's also popular it's published in English. I think it's 1580 something a year, no significance. It's a fascinating book about how ruler rules. So Wan Li Emperor was very weak. He was raised in a court. He couldn't control anything. He was literally controlled by the bureaucrats, but some of the bureaucrats turned out to be very strong. And also, he didn't bother. He stayed in court playing crickets, with his concubines and so on. And meanwhile, the economy boomed. Why? Because the command economy dissolved, the silver came in. So this, and the marketization really happened under his reign because he didn't watch them anymore. So this is something maybe it would be kind of interesting to look at. This probably goes beyond the paper, maybe goes beyond the European monarchy case, but this is something I want to raise. But overall, a really, really wonderful paper. And thanks very much. And that's all for my comments.
Thanks a lot, David. These are great comments.
Thank you, David.
In terms of procedure, should I answer quickly to
yeah,
David?
Yeah, Nico, you can briefly respond.
Yeah, just I mean, these are such nice comments. I don't feel the usual urge to defend our work. It's super constructive. So let me maybe I start by connecting the first and the last comment. So the first question was, did state perform, or one of the first question was, did state performance actually benefit the people? And I think that naturally connects to the last comment, which is, an evil but highly capable ruler might be terrible for the people. Right. So, and I think that it also connects then to another question: is our outcome variables, how useful are they actually from today's perspective? Right. So the expansion of the territory, is that important for normal people, for general welfare? In the short run, probably not. It might even be negative because war is needed for that. Urbanization or the total urban population as well. In the long run, it might well be beneficial for a state, right? To have a larger expanded territory, to have more access to natural resources. So it's not really clear that it's good for the people. But I guess what we do show is that certainly when it comes to the objective function that rulers typically had back in the day, more capable rulers were better at achieving these objectives. Right, so in a way, and one could extrapolate that and say, if now you substitute that objective function that is just very focused on the ruler signaling wealth and signaling large resources, if you substitute that with more of caring about the people, you might still get probably more positive outcomes. We do have, can I share my screen again for a second? I just wanted to show. Here we go. So we do have, let me make this large again, mechanisms, so aspects of state performance. So we did look at a whole variety of other outcomes. And I think this is, so in answering these questions, so we looked not just at territorial change, but also how did historians think was the state of law and order in those states? And that is very positively affected. So for example, say you're a merchant in a state, then you would definitely care about the state of law and order, right? So someone doesn't pay you, or and then you can go to court, or it's hard for the ruler to, or it's hard in general to expropriate you. That is something that you would care about as someone doing business or working in these states. Then also the administration tended to be more efficient. Individuals probably cared less about diplomatic prestige. But what also happens is that the general living conditions, to the extent that historians talk about general living conditions, they are actually positively affected by capable rulers. Okay, so these are also IV results. So this is the causal effect of ruler ability on living conditions. Agriculture tends to do better. Commerce tends to be better, which is not surprising because you have the right overall conditions. Manufacturing, not so much. But then again, the vast majority of that period that we look at, there's not that much manufacturing going on yet. It's only on the rise with the Industrial Revolution. Infrastructure, not much either. But there are some indications that actually people were somewhat better off. And in the interest of time, just say, yeah, so you made this point that could it be that sons who were raised as heirs, could that affect our results? It might, but I think it would work against our first stage, because it's supposed that every son, firstborn son who is raised as an heir, they're all made equal. Right, then we would have no more identifying variation in the first stage. And then you asked, is ruler ability more or less important if other rulers, probably neighbors, are weak or strong? And that's a very good point. So I think that's something that we can actually probably explore more systematically. So say our arch rivals, England and France. Right, so is it particularly beneficial if you're capable in England if the French ruler is not capable, or maybe the other way around? You want to have a capable ruler if the French ruler is also capable. So that's really something that's a great point that we can explore more. And then finally, you asked, so rulers' ability, would it still matter in a parliamentary democracy? And I agree. So to some extent, if you have a highly capable ruler in a parliamentary democracy, it still matters because that ruler would know how to handle or deal with parliament. Right? So in that dimension, it would still matter. I completely agree with you. Yeah. So thanks again. These are great comments. Thank you, Devin.
It's just not a monarchy. It's probably more likely prime minister or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. So I guess Professor Zhu Chen may want to say something. We know okay. you are doing some works on Chinese emperors, right?
Yeah. Well, in the Chinese context, maybe, well, fortunately or unfortunately, we would not have the kind of variation across many different states, because for the most part, after the Qin dynasty was founded in 221 BC, then more or less there was just one, most of the times, just one dynasty. So the kind of inbreeding across states and so on would not be something that we could get data on. But I think the most impressive innovation in this work by Nico and his co-author is that, at least from what I can see, is the identification of the IV, inbreeding as the IV, because I think many people can probably raise the endogeneity issue upon seeing that the regression results indicate a better ruler ability leads to a better state performance. Then right away many people will jump by saying, well, probably the two, there's a lot of endogeneity. But I guess the inbreeding dimension is something that's probably much less subject to endogeneity. So I do have one question related to this, Nico. That is, let's say, because both measures, that is ruler ability and state performance, are based on historians' narratives. So if the historian were very biased in the sense that, well, to begin with, he believed that inbreeding would more likely produce not so smart rulers, and then he would end up, describing all those rulers who were results of inbreeding in the most negative way about their abilities and then about their state performance. So in their history books, they would just write give all the bad descriptions about how the society was suffering in terms of violence, so that affects law and order, and also in terms of how much they failed in fighting foreign enemies and so on. So in that sense, no matter which outcome metric you focus on, based on a historian's descriptions, everything would be very dark, especially for narrative historians. It's relatively easy for them to pick a few anecdotes about this ruler's time and that ruler's time when they were biased to begin with, to want to describe a very negative, dark picture of that ruler's time in Spain or France or other states. So, but I hope there are not too many such historians who were just out there to want to prove that inbreeding leads to bad state performance because the rulers would end up being so stupid. Anyway, Nico, so how would you address this?
Right, so several layers. First, the main source that we use, Woods, as I said, he was convinced of the opposite, right? So his hypothesis, the reason for which he collected data in the first place, was to show that there's certain traits are inheritable, and he believed that inbreeding was actually good, right? Then also at the time, but not really, he didn't really have an idea about the coefficient of inbreeding. What he thought is that if kings marry, or if dynasties intermarry or intramarry, then you get positive outcomes. That's what he believed. So essentially, he was a social Darwinist, right? So this that was actually quite a prominent strand of the literature back then. Now, so if anything, the coding by Woods should work against those results. And in fact, we see that the OLS results are slightly smaller than the IV results, which often is the case. But in this paper, this is really a paper where we have a great reason for the IV results to be larger than the OLS results, because we get rid of that bias by Woods in the coding. Okay. Now, and let me just jump straight to the sort of ultimate layer of defense. We say, I don't believe that Woods, he might still have been biased and so on. And even if they didn't have an idea back when Woods did the coding, what inbreeding actually is, how it's calculated, even then there might still have been some kind of bias. Then we can look at just the results that are the reduced form, where we regress objective outcomes such as area gains and urban population. We regress that directly on inbreeding, and the inbreeding coefficient, it also cannot be, it's not subjective, it's objective, right? So we know the family tree, and so unless some historian went through the pains of falsifying the family trees of those guys, which did not happen, right? So there we have a completely unbiased coding where we have objective outcome variables and an objective explanatory variable, and then we confirm exactly what we find.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now let's turn to the questions from the audience. The first one is from Pinghan Liang. He asked, inbreeding is a clever way, but as you have said, at certain time, people may in general perceive inbreeding as an advantage. Hence, inbreeding may promote legitimacy of the ruler, consequently help the performance. This may lead to direct connection between inbreeding and state performance and affect your IV estimate results.
But so if I understand that correctly, wouldn't that go against us? So if there's more inbreeding between the parents of a ruler, so you have two famous people from a dynasty who are already closely related, they marry each other, then we find that leads to actually worse state performance because there's more inbreeding, right? So I think it would work against us if that was the case, if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah, okay. He just had a follow-up. Does monogamy explain to some degree that the Western Europe moved faster to political institution with parliamentary constraints than other regions practicing polygamy?
You have a new paper.
We can't really answer that question, and I don't want to be presumptuous and answer that question. I think there should be books written about that, or certainly at the very least a paper. Yeah. Let's leave it there, unless someone else on the panel wants to jump in.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So the next question is from one of our PhD students, Xinghao Li. Actually, I think this question has been addressed. It's also about how the neighboring states or relative ability of neighboring rulers will affect the local rulers' ability. So we just skip this. A next short question from Gavin Scott Coates. I missed the first few slides, but do the changes in area ruled by any given state include the colonies, especially Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France after the 16th century? Or are you just taking into account land area in Europe only?
Yeah, a very good question. I should have mentioned that. So we do not include colonies. It's really just European land area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
sorry, I forgot to answer one point by Devin, and that's actually similar. So Devin asked, so urbanization grows over time. Could that somehow affect our results? It shouldn't, because we just look at changes in urbanization, right? So to the extent that there's a trend in levels, it shouldn't really matter much because we just look at changes during each reign. Yeah. Okay.
There's a question by Pei Gao, the last question, which is, I think, is quite good. Do you want to?
Yeah. Maybe perhaps this the final question from Pei Gao. Many thanks for this interesting talk. I'm wondering that the inbreeding coefficients also capture the strong connections of these rulers in powerful families. It means that the variation of your IV not only reflects lower ability of rulers, but also less motivation to build their reputation.
Okay. So there are, okay, maybe let me share the screen again, because I think there are different ways in which we can,
so it means they're basically lazy if they're already, you know, royal families. Yeah,
exactly. So one thing that we can do is, so is it just, and I think this is related, right? So could it be that initially when you have the first founder of a state, that's the really super capable person, and then there's more and more inbreeding, and over time they become less motivated because they're already from this great dynasty. So if what we can do here is, and again, I know this is not directly addressing the question, so I'll do different pieces that I think each contribute to addressing this question a little bit. So here's the first step. One thing we can do is, to the extent that over time you become more and more, I don't know, you're the 10th of your dynasty, you're very entitled, you know, there has been a lot of intermarriage, but you're also in this great position already, so why should you exert a lot of effort? And I think this sort of goes in this direction of that comment. So what we can do is we can include fixed effects for the order of a monarch within the dynasty. So if you're the 10th in a dynasty, then there's a fixed effect for being the 10th, right? So for example, if you look at Carlos III, he was the 3rd in the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, but there were also the French Bourbon. So if you look at the overall Bourbon dynasty, Carlos III would be the 8th. Okay, so what we do is we include fixed effects for the order in either the domestic dynasty or in the international dynasty. So you have a fixed effect for 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so on, right? For each order in the dynasty. And you see it doesn't change results at all. Okay, so that's sort of one way to get there, or to answer that question. Another way would be to look at, so could it be that there are some kind of, let me see where that is. So are there some kind of dynamics where somehow state performance is related to the strategic marriage? So are you more likely to marry someone who is close kin if the state is not doing well, or the other way around? So what we can do is we can control for these lags in state performance. Let me just show you the IV result. So we look for, and the lag here means go one reign back, right? So here you go, L, you go back one leg to the parent generation, and L2, you go back to the grandparent generation. And we can do this both for lags in inbreeding and for lags in state performance. And you see that none of this matters in itself for current state performance, and it doesn't confound our results. And then finally, I think, so the comment was, so what now if you have these great parents who got married, and then, you know, you're very inbred, but you don't need to exert much effort? I think yet another way to address it is when we exclude the inbreeding from the parent generation by just looking at this hidden degree of inbreeding, which we used here. I think that can also, at least to some extent, address that concern. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So for time reasons, we not go over all the questions, but we will definitely forward the remaining questions and the comments to Nico for his consideration. So finally, thank you again, Nico, for the wonderful talk and your time, and also Professor Debin's excellent discussion. Finally, let me just a reminder for audience who are watching our webinar in the Facebook, please just join our mailing list to receive the updates and the announcement for the events for next week. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was really
thank you.
a pleasure.
Thank you.